News Tonight, the FBI director says that suicide bombers will strike the United States. It is inevitable. Lie detector tests for hundreds of government workers. An ABC News exclusive in search of the person who mailed the anthrax. An epidemic of con artists, legacy hunters, and other criminals. We'll take a closer look at cheating older Americans. And what will become of the polar bear if they have to do with less ice? Is there trouble in the frozen kingdom?
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone. We're going to begin tonight with the question of safety. The director of the FBI said today that suicide bombers are going to attack in the United States. It was the second time in 24 hours that a senior official in the Bush administration has said some sort of attack was going to take place here. The FBI director, Robert Mueller, said he thought a suicide bombing, similar to what we have seen in the Middle East, was inevitable, and his remarks have certainly added to the tension. Our chief investigative correspondent, Brian Ross, is here and picks up the story.
Well, Peter, as you know, Mideast groups meet regularly, but today, American intelligence and law enforcement officials tell ABC News that al-Qaeda leaders joined these Hamas and Hezbollah leaders in a secret session in Lebanon in late March to discuss tactics and an unprecedented level of joint activity. Officials say the summit was the springboard for a new round of attacks they fear are being planned now against the U.S., Great Britain, and other targets. Intelligence on the meeting has been passed to the FBI, whose director, Robert Mueller, today talked of the possible consequence of such an alliance. His prediction of almost inevitable walk-in suicide bombings in this country.
I think the FBI director is erring on the side of let's shoot straight with the American people and really tell the American people what might be ahead. This war is not over.
Officials say the growing concern is based both on intercepted messages and the fact that the secret summit in Lebanon marks the first time bin Laden's al-Qaeda group has put aside rivalries to work with others, such as Hezbollah and Hamas.
Now that we think that they have been meeting and discussing, I think that's a startling development, and it makes it very, very dangerous.
Officials believe al-Qaeda has already begun the next wave of attacks. An al-Qaeda official claimed responsibility over the weekend for the bombing of an historic synagogue in Tunisia last month, captured on a home video camera. The blast killed 19, including German tourists. And French officials believe al-Qaeda was responsible for a bomb blast 2 weeks ago that killed 11 French civilians in Pakistan, who were on a secret military mission in that country. And now American officials fear that a series of apartment building bombings in Russia, blamed on a Jordanian-born Chechnyan with al-Qaeda connections, could be copied in this country. Apartments were rigged with explosives, disguised as deliveries of sugar, and then detonated simultaneously with truck bombs outside the building. More than 300 people died. Despite the public warnings of the FBI director today and the vice president yesterday, the official threat status in the country remains as it has been since March, when the administration announced its color code system. Yellow, Peter, which stands for a significant but not high threat of a terror attack.
Which leads me to a question I've heard several times today. And do we believe this is new and valid information, or, as some people have asked, is it the Bush administration trying to distract people's attention from the fact that it's been criticized severely in the last little while?
Well, it's some of both. This is new information that the law enforcement officials we're talking to say they have decided to put out much more than they ever have before in a public way. But it also has the benefit of distracting attention from the signals the administration so badly missed prior to September 11th.
Okay, many thanks. Brian Ross. An ABC News Washington Post poll finds the public's confidence in the government's ability to prevent terrorism is actually declining. On September the 11th, just after the attack, 66% of Americans said they thought the government could prevent a future one. That number has now dropped to 46%. And 56% of Americans support a congressional investigation into how the Bush administration handled intelligence before the September attacks. ABC News has also learned today that hundreds of government workers will be asked to take a lie detector test in the hope that one of them might produce a lead in the case of last year's anthrax attacks. Here's our Justice Department correspondent, Pierre Thomas.
The government wants to administer polygraphs to as many as 200 current and former employees at Fort Detrick, Dugway Proving Grounds, and a number of other labs. Sources tell ABC News investigators want to talk to experts in the production of anthrax or to those who have had access to it.
In the absence of a prime suspect, the FBI has to build its case through subtraction, taking away the elements that don't fit, trying to make their theory work.
Without a clear suspect, the government has been frustrated for months. The polygraphing is the latest attempt to generate new leads. Law enforcement officials say the anthrax is consistent with the Ames anthrax strain, which was stored by the U.S. military at Fort Detrick and then distributed to a number of labs for research. One law enforcement source tells ABC News, faced with a lot of dead ends, there's a growing sense of urgency. He said whoever murdered 5 people could strike again any time. Pierre Thomas, ABC News, New York.
In the national briefing tonight, the Justice Department says the government system for identifying and monitoring foreign students is inadequate. The department's Inspector General says it is unlikely to meet its deadline for replacing the system. In North Carolina, 2 men went on trial for smuggling cigarettes to allegedly help the group Hezbollah in Lebanon, which the government calls a terrorist organization. Their lawyer says it'll be extremely hard to find an impartial jury. And government meteorologists predicted today that this year's hurricane season will be slightly heavier than usual. They expect between 9 and 13 tropical storms, including 6 to 8 hurricanes. This is Cuba's Independence Day. 100 years ago, Cuba was occupied by the United States. President Bush used the occasion to enunciate his policy on Cuba just a week after former President Jimmy Carter paid a visit. Mr. Carter called for an end to trade sanctions. President Bush has a different approach. ABC's Terry Moran is in Miami.
The president today took a hard rhetorical line on Fidel Castro, hurling insults at the Cuban leader.
By a relic from another era who has turned a beautiful island into a prison.
And in Miami later, Mr. Bush rallied Cuban Americans.
Viva Cuba Libre!
Aides admit the president's approach is not a new policy, and there's little chance Castro will respond to his initiative. Mr. Bush declared the U.S. would ease the trade and travel ban with Cuba if and only if the Castro regime undertook specific reforms, including allowing opposition parties in the upcoming 2003 Cuban elections, releasing all political prisoners, and permitting independent trade unions.
Meaningful reform on Cuba's part will be answered with a meaningful American response.
I'm delighted to be here.
Mr. Bush stands in stark contrast to President Jimmy Carter, who just returned from a trip to Cuba in which he called for an easing of the embargo. Many Democrats accused President Bush of lacking vision.
The U.S. Congress and the American people are not frozen in the past, as it would appear President Bush and Fidel Castro are. We are working for change in our policies.
Many Republicans, especially from farm states, are also pushing for change, supporting legislation to provide federal financing for agricultural deals with Havana. Mr. Bush rejected that idea.
No, I will not allow our taxpayers' money to go to enrich the Castro regime, and I'm willing to use my veto.
Aides say today's announcement was the culmination of a long-running policy review at the White House and reflects Mr. Bush's deeply held concerns. But, Peter, there's also no question that taking a tough line on Cuba will help the president's brother Jeb with Cuban Americans in his re-election effort. And tonight, the president will raise $2 million from the Cuban American community towards that effort.
Thank you, Terry. Been a political question for many presidents. The overseas briefing tonight begins with the birth of a nation. East Timor celebrated its first day as the world's newest country, ending almost 5 centuries of occupation, most recently by Indonesia. The government was sworn in today. The new president said the work had just begun. The tiny country of 800,000 people is one of the poorest in the world, but they fought for it. Pakistan called today for international monitors to be sent to the disputed region of Kashmir, which both India and Pakistan claim. This is the latest effort to diffuse increasing tension between India and Pakistan. For the 4th straight day, Indian and Pakistani forces exchanged heavy artillery fire across the Kashmiri border. In northern Israel, a suicide bomber blew himself up near the town of Afula. No one else was killed or injured. The bomber detonated his explosives when police approached him. And scientists say that Mexico's most active volcano, Colima, may erupt again. People in the area 300 miles west of Mexico City were evacuated over the weekend. The last major eruption there was 3 years ago. When we come back, we'll take a closer look at older Americans who are sometimes easy prey for con artists.
We went to lunch, dinner, and wherever she wanted to go all the time. And then every time she went out with me, she said she needed money for something.
In the other news tonight, a new famine threatens millions of people. Man's mistakes leave children dying. And at the end of the broadcast tonight, the polar bear, who stalks a shrinking domain. His frozen hunting grounds are melting. On Capitol Hill today, the Senate has held hearings into the widespread abuse and cheating of older Americans. This is a serious problem which some senators believe receives less attention than is given to other vulnerable groups. Here's some examples. The U.S. now spends more than $1 billion preventing child abuse, just over $500 million preventing violence against women. It has no comprehensive program to protect the elderly and only spends $22 million protecting them. So let's take a closer look. Here's ABC's Jackie Judd.
Carl Fiocchi was 78 years old and lonely when he met a young woman.
I'd say, I love you a whole bunch. She said, I love you more. Sounds like teenagers.
It wasn't love at all, but an alleged scam to take everything Fiocchi owned.
I gave her $25,000 to get into a coffee business. Then later I gave her $10,000 to get a pickup.
The woman reportedly has said the money and his house were gifts. That kind of financial exploitation is on the rise. In 2000, 11% of the crimes reported against the elderly involved financial theft. In 2001, with only partial figures in, the number is 13%. Senator John Breaux says this and all forms of elder abuse deserve the same high profile that the abuse of children and women gets in Washington.
We have found no single federal employee in the entire government working full-time on elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation.
Local laws, for the most part, already exist to protect elderly victims. But police and prosecutors often are not trained to unravel financial scams or to deal with older witnesses who may be forgetful and reluctant.
This isn't stuff that we learn in law school. And these are areas that are complex, that are specialized, and that take some special training.
My name's Valeria.
There are some people focused on this. One example, a task force in Santa Clara County, California called FAST, Financial Abuse Specialist Team. The key is to work fast, sometimes responding to tips, and move in before the damage is done.
The issue is about getting out immediately to go to a bank where we know that a perpetrator is about to talk an elder and removing $80,000 to $100,000 in a bank account.
As for Carl Fiocchi, his lawyer says his case has been bounced between police departments. He's filed a civil suit and has declared bankruptcy. Jackie Judd, ABC News, Washington.
Closer look for today. We were stunned to learn today that one of the country's most widely read and most appreciated scientists has died. Stephen Jay Gould had a uniquely diverse and interesting career. Only this month he published a book touching on the whole of natural history. Professor Gould made his name as a scholar of evolution and a gifted writer for a popular audience. Here's ABC's Ned Potter.
Stephen Jay Gould was a man of the ages, the Jurassic, the Cretaceous, the Precambrian.
Speed and grace.
But he was also in love with the seventh inning and a million other things that might seem unlikely for a scientist. Here's how he once asked a reporter to identify him.
Paleontologist, professor at Harvard, and lifelong Yankee fan.
His main field of study was evolutionary biology. He made his mark by arguing that species evolve in fits and starts, not continuously. But it was as a writer of 20 books and hundreds of articles that he brought science to the rest of the world and became world famous.
You can agree with him or disagree with him, but one thing is for certain, he's going to bring a connection or a point of view to the subject that you hadn't thought of before.
Gould wrote about the eons, but he was only 60 when he died today of cancer. Ned Potter, ABC News, New York.
Back in just a moment.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Aflac.
Ask about it at work.
The Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill arrived in Ghana today in West Africa to begin a tour to determine how effective foreign aid has been for the world's poorest continent. He's traveling with the rock star Bono, who has long campaigned for more aid and attention for Africa. The visit is part of a new U.S. initiative the Secretary calls Aid with Accountability, which takes us tonight to southern Africa. ABC's Martin Seemungle reports tonight from Malawi, a country that needs more aid and more attention.
They are some of the saddest women in Africa. They walked for miles, carrying their children to this relief station in the small village of Misewe. The weighing and the measuring confirm the worst fears. Mary Corbett has seen this before in Ethiopia, and she knows exactly what it means.
They may not last very long. The severe cases could die in a few days, in a week. The moderate cases, it would depend really on what other complications they have. They may not last very long either.
No one is sure how many people have died. 1 million people are at risk.
If we don't get enough food in, it's not going to be just the children affected. It's going to be the families affected, whole villages affected. If we can't get enough food in, people are going to die.
Corn, or maize as it's called here, is the staple food, and the harvest has failed. These people can no longer feed their children, so they have come to this abandoned church hoping for help.
It would be easy to blame nature for this suffering in Malawi. It's true that the recent cycle of floods and drought caused tremendous hardship, but there is no one single reason why there is a crisis. There are a number of reasons, and a startling number of those reasons are man-made.
This giant complex is Malawi's national grain reserve, meant for an emergency. It can hold thousands of tons of maize. Today, it's virtually empty. That's because under pressure from the International Monetary Fund, Malawi sold the grain to pay off its massive debt. Now most of the cash has disappeared, allegedly pocketed by corrupt government officials. So people are angry at the government and the IMF. Now Malawi has been forced to import food, but the prices are well out of reach for the people in need. In the village of Indewele, Bison Mungwende surveys his storage bin. This is supposed to feed him and his 9 children until next year. I'm getting very worried, he says. Off camera, away from his family, he told us quietly, unless he can find a way to get food, at least 2 of his children will die. In Malawi, many people will die. Martin Seemungle, ABC News, Misewe, Malawi.
When we come back this evening, the last item in the broadcast, tracking the polar bears on the northern Ace. What is their future? Finally from us this evening, the future of the polar bears. Scientists believe they evolved about 200,000 years ago from their brown bear ancestors. Today, there are more than 20,000 polar bears living in the wild, and there may be trouble ahead. Here's ABC's Richard Gisbert.
From any vantage point, a polar bear can be an incredible sight. They are built to survive the most brutal cold, but nothing has equipped them for what is happening now.
We're looking 50, 60 years ahead. And we're saying, unless we take action now, polar bears will lose most of their habitats.
That's because it's getting warmer. The polar ice cap is melting, shrinking by 3% every decade, and the bears need that ice. In winter, they live on ice floes, hunting seals and other prey. Polar bears bulk up on fat so they can then survive the lean months of summer, when melting ice forces them to head for land where food is scarce.
The sea ice is melting earlier in the spring, which is sending the polar bears to land earlier without them having developed enough fat reserves to survive the ice-free season.
Norwegian scientists are working to help the bears, first by documenting their movements. They have chased the animals down with helicopters, sedated them with tranquilizer guns, and fitted them with collars equipped with beacons.
Okay, what's the ID number on that collar?
So they can track the animals by satellite.
Can you read it?
The helicopters are also used to weigh the bears, and the Norwegians have found some mothers are so underweight they now lack the strength to feed their cubs. Not everyone agrees global warming is a man-made phenomenon, but there is no arguing the effect it's having on Arctic wildlife, particularly this Arctic giant that has never looked quite this vulnerable. Richard Gisbert, ABC News, London.
That is our report on World News Tonight. For the remainder of this week, President Bush goes to Russia, the growing problem of banking fraud, in which thieves steal people's ATM numbers. And do chimpanzees have some of the same rights as people? I'm Peter Jennings. Have a good evening and good night.